The forgotten hero of Apollo 11. Everyone knows Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history that July, but nobody knows about Frank Morrison, the 62-year-old janitor who saved the moon landing from the extremists who tried to stop it the night before launch. Welcome to Hidden Valor Stories. Before we begin this untold story of the forgotten guardian who protected America's greatest achievement, tell me in the comments, do you remember watching the moon landing? Were you one of the 650 million people who witnessed history that day? And if you believe the unsung heroes deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served in the shadows of our greatest moments. July 15, 1969. Kennedy Space Center hummed with the controlled excitement that only comes once in human history. In 18 hours, 3 men would sit atop a tower of fire and rocket toward the moon, carrying with them the dreams and fears of an entire nation locked in Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. The hallways bustled with engineers clutching coffee cups and calculation sheets, astronauts walking with the purposeful stride of men about to make history, and NASA officials whose careers had built toward this singular moment. Television crews from around the world set up equipment to broadcast humanity's greatest adventure. And through it all, pushing a gray metal cart loaded with mops, buckets, and industrial cleaning supplies, moved Frank Morrison. At 62, Frank had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. His gray hair was always neat, his custodial uniform always pressed, and his work boots polished to a military shine that few people noticed. He'd been mopping floors and emptying trash cans at NASA for 15 years, long enough to become part of the furniture, invisible to the brilliant minds who were sending men to the moon. That invisibility was exactly what Frank Morrison had wanted. "Evening, Mr. Morrison," called Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the computer specialists who worked late preparing Apollo 11's guidance systems. She was one of the few people who bothered to learn his name. "Evening, Doc," Frank replied, his voice carrying the slight Texas drawl that marked him as a local. "You folks gonna make history tomorrow?" Dr. Chen smiled tiredly. "We're sure going to try. These computers have to be perfect. One calculation error and those boys might never come home." Frank nodded gravely. "Well, you just focus on your numbers. I'll make sure your workspace stays clean and safe." What Dr. Chen didn't know, what none of the NASA personnel knew, was that Frank Morrison understood those computers better than most of the engineers. During his 23 years in the Army, he'd been trained on the most sophisticated targeting systems America possessed. He'd spent 2 years during the Cuban Missile Crisis inside NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain complex, where a single keystroke mistake could have started World War III. Frank had volunteered for custodial work at NASA, not because he needed the job, but because he'd made himself a promise during those terrifying October days in 1962. If America ever reached for something greater than mutual destruction, he would be there to protect it. As Frank moved through the corridors of the vehicle assembly building, he performed his dual routine. To anyone watching, he was simply an old janitor doing his job. But his trained eyes were conducting a security sweep that would have impressed his former commanding officers. He noted which doors had been propped open contrary to protocol. He memorized faces of personnel working late shifts. He cataloged equipment that had been moved since his previous round. Most importantly, he watched for anything that didn't belong in the most secure facility in America. At 11:47 p.m., Frank noticed something that made him pause while emptying a wastebasket near the mission control entrance. A white panel van had been parked in the contractor lot for 3 hours, but no one had emerged from it. The vehicle bore the markings of Henderson Electronics, a legitimate company that provided maintenance services to NASA. But Frank's memory was sharp. Henderson's crew had finished their work that morning and signed out at 2:15 p.m. Frank continued his cleaning routine, but his senses were now fully alert. During his military years, he'd learned that the greatest threats often came disguised as the most ordinary things. At 12:23 a.m., 3 men finally emerged from the van. They wore Henderson Electronics uniforms and carried proper identification badges. Their toolboxes looked regulation, their vehicle was authentic, and their paperwork would probably check out under casual inspection. But Frank Morrison's inspection was never casual. The men moved wrong. Instead of the loose, casual gait of contractors coming back from a late dinner, they walked with military precision. Their eyes swept the environment in overlapping patterns that suggested coordinated surveillance training. Most tellingly, the man in the rear kept his right hand positioned near his waistband, in the classic ready position for drawing a concealed weapon. Frank had seen that stance before, in places where American soldiers guarded secrets that could end the world. These men weren't contractors, they were operators. And they were moving toward mission control 18 hours before Apollo 11 was scheduled to make history. Frank continued mopping the corridor while his mind shifted into tactical assessment mode. 24 years old again, standing guard over nuclear launch consoles while President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev played chess with humanity's survival. The three infiltrators split up with professional efficiency. One headed toward the main mission control entrance, another toward the computer center, and the third disappeared in the direction of the communications array. Classic pattern for a coordinated assault on multiple objectives. Frank abandoned his cleaning cart and moved with the silent efficiency he'd learned patrolling the Korean DMZ. His first priority was intelligence gathering, understanding the threat before attempting to counter it. He followed the first infiltrator, using service corridors and maintenance passages that most NASA personnel didn't know existed. Frank knew them all. During his 15 years as a custodian, he'd made it his business to understand every inch of the facility that housed America's space program. The infiltrator reached mission control and began working on the electronic lock with equipment that definitely wasn't standard contractor gear. Frank recognized the device, a military-grade bypass unit designed to defeat security systems without triggering alarms. This wasn't industrial sabotage or theft. This was an assault on the moon landing itself. Frank's mind flashed back to October 1962, to the underground bunker where he'd stood guard over Titan missile launch keys while Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba. He remembered Colonel Bradley's words during the briefing that had changed his life. "Gentlemen, there are people in this world who would rather see civilization destroyed than see it transcend its limitations. Tonight you stand between them and Armageddon." Frank had thought those words applied only to nuclear war. Now he understood they applied to any moment when humanity reached for something greater than its fears. The infiltrator bypassed the security lock and disappeared into mission control. Frank gave him a 30-second head start, then followed. Inside the cathedral-like space where Apollo 11's flight would be monitored, Frank saw the man opening a military-style equipment case near the primary guidance computers. Even in the dim emergency lighting, Frank could identify the components: plastic explosives, electronic timers, and radio-controlled detonators. Enough explosive power to destroy the computers that would guide Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins to the moon and back. Frank Morrison had spent 7 years learning how to kill people efficiently, and 15 years learning how to protect things quietly. But he'd never faced a situation that required both skills simultaneously. Until now. The infiltrator was focused on his bomb assembly, his back turned to the entrance. Frank could have taken him silently, a sleeper hold learned in Special Forces training, applied with the patience that came from years of invisible service. But Frank heard footsteps in the corridor. The other two infiltrators were moving toward their own targets, probably carrying similar devices. If he neutralized this man, the others would be alerted when he failed to check in. Frank needed a different approach. He retreated to his custodial cart and selected his weapons: a bottle of industrial ammonia, a heavy-duty flashlight, and the ring of master keys that gave him access to every room in the complex. Then he did something that went against every instinct developed during his military career. He triggered the fire alarm. The shrieking klaxon that filled Kennedy Space Center wasn't part of any tactical manual Frank had studied, but it served multiple purposes. It would bring security personnel running, it would force the infiltrators to accelerate their timeline, and it would give Frank Morrison permission to move through the facility like a man with legitimate authority. Because in a crisis, everyone listened to the person who seemed to know what they were doing. And after 23 years in the Army and 15 years at NASA, Frank Morrison definitely knew what he was doing. The fire alarm transformed Kennedy Space Center from a temple of scientific precision into controlled chaos. Emergency lights bathed corridors in red, security teams activated lockdown protocols, and NASA personnel began evacuating according to procedures Frank had helped develop during his years of invisible observation. But Frank wasn't evacuating, he was hunting. The first infiltrator emerged from mission control, his bomb-planting mission interrupted by the alarm. He spoke urgently into a radio, probably coordinating with his team to determine whether their operation had been compromised. Frank approached him with the steady confidence of a custodian who'd responded to dozens of emergency drills. "Sir, you need to evacuate immediately," Frank called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone following official protocol. "This is a code red situation." The infiltrator turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his concealed weapon. But what he saw was a 62-year-old janitor in a gray uniform, holding a flashlight and looking concerned about proper evacuation procedures. "Where's the nearest exit?" the infiltrator asked, playing his role while probably calculating whether this old man posed any threat to his mission. "Right this way, sir," Frank replied, gesturing toward a corridor that led not to an exit, but to the facility's central security office. As they walked, Frank maintained his helpful custodian persona while conducting a professional assessment of his opponent. The man was physically fit, probably 40 years old, and moved with the controlled alertness that suggested military training. His toolkit contained bomb-making materials, which meant he was skilled in demolitions. Most importantly, his radio indicated he was part of a coordinated team. Frank had faced worse odds in Korea, but never while protecting something as precious as humanity's first steps toward the stars. "Just through here," Frank said, gesturing toward a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The infiltrator hesitated for the first time. "Are you sure this is the evacuation route?" 15 years I've been working here," Frank replied with the patience of a man who'd answered countless questions from confused visitors. "I know every way out of this place." What Frank knew was that the door led to a supply closet with no exit, thick walls that would muffle sounds, and enough industrial cleaning supplies to immobilize someone without leaving permanent damage. The infiltrator followed Frank through the door, then immediately realized his mistake. But Frank Morrison had been planning this confrontation for 30 seconds, and 30 seconds was a lifetime for someone with his training. The industrial ammonia hit the infiltrator's eyes and respiratory system before he could draw his weapon. While he was blinded and gasping, Frank used the heavy flashlight to strike specific pressure points that would render him unconscious without causing lasting injury. Frank had no desire to kill anyone, he just needed to protect the moon landing. He secured the unconscious infiltrator with zip ties from his custodial supplies, disabled the man's radio, and examined the bomb components he'd been carrying. Military-grade C4 plastic explosive, enough to destroy Mission Control's primary computers. Timer set for 6:30 a.m., exactly 2 hours before Apollo 11's scheduled launch. One threat neutralized, 2 more to go. Frank emerged from the supply closet to find NASA security teams responding to the fire alarm with efficiency that would have made his old Army unit proud. But they were following evacuation protocols, not hunting saboteurs. They had no idea that domestic terrorists were trying to prevent the greatest achievement in human history. Frank could have alerted security about the remaining infiltrators, but that would have required explanations he wasn't prepared to give. Questions about how a custodian had recognized and captured a trained operative. Inquiries into his background that might reveal skills he'd spent 15 years keeping hidden. Frank Morrison had chosen invisibility for a reason. Tonight that invisibility was his greatest weapon. He returned to his custodial cart and continued his hunt. The second infiltrator had reached the IBM System 360 computer center that housed Apollo 11's guidance calculations. These massive machines, each weighing several tons and containing millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge technology, held the mathematical precision that would navigate 3 men across 240,000 miles of space and bring them home safely. Frank found the infiltrator working methodically to plant explosives among the computer banks, his movements suggesting extensive technical knowledge. This wasn't random terrorism, it was a sophisticated attempt to cripple America's space program at its most vulnerable moment. Frank approached using a different strategy this time. Instead of playing the helpful custodian, he became the security-conscious employee following emergency protocols. "Sir," Frank called out sharply, using the command voice he'd developed as a sergeant, "you're not supposed to be in here during a fire alarm." The infiltrator looked up from his bomb assembly, irritated by the interruption but not yet alarmed. He saw an old janitor with a flashlight, someone who might complicate his mission but didn't pose a serious threat. "I'm with Henderson Electronics," the infiltrator replied, showing his forged identification. "I need to secure this equipment before evacuation." "Not my problem," Frank said with the stubborn authority of a longtime employee. "Emergency protocols say everyone out, no exceptions. You can argue with the fire chief when he gets here." Frank was gambling that the infiltrator's training emphasized avoiding unnecessary attention during covert operations. A confrontation with facility personnel, even a lowly janitor, could compromise the entire mission. The infiltrator calculated his options for several seconds, then began packing his bomb-making materials. "Fine, which way to the nearest exit?" "Follow me," Frank said, leading him toward another carefully chosen destination. This time, Frank guided the infiltrator toward the facility's loading dock, where industrial equipment was moved in and out of the complex. The area was deserted during the late shift, isolated from the main evacuation routes and equipped with the kind of heavy machinery that could restrain someone if properly applied. As they walked, Frank's mind raced through tactical possibilities. This infiltrator was more cautious than the first, more aware of his surroundings, and probably better trained in combat techniques. Frank would need to use his environment more creatively. "Right through that door," Frank said, gesturing toward the loading dock entrance. The infiltrator paused, his suspicion finally overriding his operational discipline. "Wait a minute. You're not taking me to an exit. You're—" Frank didn't wait for him to finish the thought. 15 years of custodial work had given him intimate knowledge of every piece of equipment in the facility, including the overhead crane system used to move rocket components. Frank hit the crane's emergency release switch, sending a 2-ton equipment platform swinging directly toward the infiltrator's position. The man dove sideways, his reflexes saving him from serious injury, but putting him off balance and separated from his equipment case. Frank followed up with a move he'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training 30 years earlier, a joint lock that used the opponent's momentum against them. The infiltrator was skilled, but Frank had decades of experience and the advantage of knowing exactly where he was fighting. The struggle lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, the second infiltrator was unconscious, his bomb components secured, and Frank Morrison was breathing hard but uninjured. 2 down, 1 to go. But as Frank secured the second infiltrator, he heard something that made his blood run cold, the distinctive whine of electronics being powered up, coming from the direction of the communications array. The third infiltrator wasn't just planting a bomb, he was activating something. Frank ran through the corridors of Kennedy Space Center with speed that would have surprised anyone who thought of him as just an old janitor. His military conditioning, maintained through 15 years of physical labor, carried him toward the communications center where Apollo 11's contact with Mission Control would be coordinated. If the third infiltrator succeeded in destroying the communications array, the astronauts would be isolated in space, cut off from the ground support that could guide them through emergencies or bring them home if something went wrong. Frank reached the communications center to find the door standing open and electronic equipment humming with activity. But this wasn't the sound of bomb timers, it was the purposeful whine of powerful transmitters being brought online. The third infiltrator wasn't trying to destroy the communications array, he was trying to use it. Frank peered into the room to see a man in his 40s connecting military-style radio equipment to NASA's transmission systems. On a nearby table, Frank could see maps, frequency charts, and what looked like Soviet technical manuals. This wasn't domestic terrorism, this was espionage. The infiltrator was using Apollo 11's launch as cover to transmit classified information directly to the Soviet Union. While America celebrated its greatest achievement, secrets that had cost billions of dollars to develop would be radioed to Moscow. Frank Morrison had spent 2 years of his life guarding nuclear missiles from Soviet infiltration. He'd sworn an oath to protect American secrets from foreign enemies. That oath hadn't expired when he'd become a custodian. Frank entered the communications center with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. "Excuse me, sir," Frank said in his most polite custodian voice. "I need to clean this room." The infiltrator looked up from his equipment, annoyance flashing across his face. He was so close to completing his mission that an interruption by a janitor seemed like cosmic injustice. "Get out," the infiltrator snapped. "I'm conducting authorized maintenance." "Sorry, sir," Frank replied, pushing his custodial cart closer to the transmission equipment. "Fire alarm means I have to secure all work areas. Company policy." The infiltrator's hand moved toward his weapon, but Frank was already in motion. 15 years of mopping floors had given him an intimate understanding of how liquid behaved on different surfaces, how much force was needed to move heavy objects, and how industrial equipment could be used for purposes beyond its design. Frank overturned his mop bucket, sending gallons of ammonia-based cleaning solution directly into the Soviet transmission equipment. Sparks flew, circuits shorted, and thousands of dollars worth of espionage gear died in a cascade of electrical failures. The infiltrator lunged for his weapon, but Frank was ready with the one tool that had served him faithfully through every crisis of the past 15 years, his mop handle. Not as sophisticated as the weapons he'd carried in the army, but perfectly balanced, exactly the right length for close-quarters combat, and wielded by hands that had never forgotten their training. The fight was brief but decisive. When it ended, the third infiltrator was unconscious, his equipment was destroyed, and Frank Morrison was standing amid the wreckage of a Soviet espionage operation that could have crippled America's space program. Frank looked at his watch. 3:17 a.m. In 5 hours and 13 minutes, Apollo 11 would launch on schedule, carrying 3 men toward humanity's greatest adventure. Thanks to a 62-year-old custodian, they would make that journey safely. July 16, 1969, 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Frank Morrison stood in the crowd of NASA personnel watching from the viewing area as Apollo 11 rose on a pillar of fire toward the Florida sky. The Saturn V rocket, as tall as a 36-story building and weighing 6 million pounds, lifted off with the power of 85 Hoover dams, carrying Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins toward the moon. Around Frank, engineers cheered, administrators wept with relief, and television commentators struggled to find words adequate for the moment. Walter Cronkite's voice crackled from nearby radios, describing the launch that would be remembered as long as humans told stories about courage and exploration. Frank watched in quiet satisfaction, knowing that the computers guiding Apollo 11 contained the calculations that would bring the astronauts home safely. The communications array that would maintain contact throughout their journey was functioning perfectly, and the Soviet Union would receive no stolen intelligence about America's space technology. No one in the crowd knew that Frank Morrison had prevented 3 separate attacks on the moon landing. The official report would list the previous night's incidents as equipment malfunctions and false alarm responses. The 3 infiltrators would be processed through intelligence channels that preferred secrecy to publicity. Frank Morrison would return to mopping floors and emptying trash cans, invisible once again to the brilliant minds who reached for the stars. But that invisibility no longer felt like exile, it felt like service. Hell of a thing, isn't it, Frank? Dr. Sarah Chen appeared beside him, her face radiant with the joy of witnessing history. "Yes, ma'am," Frank replied, his Texas drawl soft with emotion. "Hell of a thing." "You know," Dr. Chen continued, "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about keeping our workspace safe. I realize now how important that is. There are probably threats we never even think about." Frank nodded, watching Apollo 11 disappear into the blue sky above Cape Kennedy. "There's always someone trying to stop progress, Doc. But there's also always someone standing guard." Dr. Chen followed his gaze skyward. "I'm glad you were here, Frank. I'm glad you were watching over us." Frank Morrison smiled, thinking of a promise he'd made 7 years earlier during the Cuban Missile Crisis, to protect America when it reached for something greater than mutual destruction. Mission accomplished. 4 days later, the world watched in wonder as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and spoke the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Frank Morrison watched from the break room at Kennedy Space Center, sharing the moment with the custodial staff who kept the facility running during humanity's greatest adventure. They were all invisible to the cameras, forgotten by the historians, unmentioned in the speeches that would commemorate this day. But they were the foundation upon which the impossible became reality. "You know what I love about this," said Maria Santos, who cleaned the laboratories where moon rock samples would be analyzed. "We're all part of it. Every person who worked here, who believed in it, who kept it safe, we're all part of putting those men on the moon." Frank nodded, understanding that Maria was wiser than most people gave her credit for. The moon landing wasn't just the achievement of astronauts and rocket scientists. It was the culmination of hundreds of thousands of people doing their jobs with dedication and pride, protecting America's dreams from those who would destroy them. Over the following months, Frank watched Apollo 11's crew return to heroes' welcomes, ticker-tape parades, and meetings with world leaders. They deserved every accolade, every honor, every moment of recognition. They had risked their lives to expand the boundaries of human possibility. But Frank also thought about the other heroes who would never be recognized, the security guards who protected the facilities, the technicians who assembled the rockets, the computer programmers who calculated the trajectories, and yes, the custodians who kept the workshops clean and the secrets safe. Frank's military records remained classified, his actions during the infiltration attempt buried in intelligence files that would never see public light. He received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition for preventing attacks that could have derailed humanity's greatest achievement. He did receive something more valuable, a handwritten note from Dr. Werner von Braun, the German-American rocket pioneer who led NASA's Saturn V development. Mr. Morrison, the note read, I understand there were incidents during Apollo 11's preparation that required your intervention. While I cannot know the details, I want you to understand that your service has been noted by those who matter. The moon landing succeeded because of people like you, those who protect our dreams while asking for nothing in return. Thank you for your vigilance, your courage, and your dedication to humanity's future among the stars. Frank framed the note and hung it in his small apartment, the only recognition he would ever receive for the night he saved the moon landing. Frank Morrison continued working as a custodian at Kennedy Space Center for another 16 years, protecting America's space program through Apollo 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. He was there when the Space Shuttle program began, when the first American woman went to space, and when the Challenger crew died in their pursuit of the stars. He never again faced armed infiltrators or Soviet espionage operations, but he maintained his vigilance. Every night as he mopped floors and emptied wastebaskets, Frank Morrison stood guard over humanity's ongoing effort to transcend the limitations of Earth. The younger NASA employees who worked alongside him in the 1970s and 1980s knew him as a reliable, competent custodian who took pride in his work. They had no idea that the quiet man with the Texas drawl had once prevented attacks that could have changed the course of history. When Frank retired in 1985, NASA held a small ceremony recognizing his 31 years of service. He received a gold watch, a certificate of appreciation, and warm words from administrators who praised his dedication and reliability. The ceremony made no mention of July 15, 1969, or the 3 infiltrators who had tried to sabotage Apollo 11. Those secrets would remain buried in classified files for decades. But Dr. Sarah Chen, now a senior NASA administrator, understood the deeper meaning of Frank Morrison's service. During the retirement ceremony, she spoke about the importance of people who protect our dreams while asking for nothing in return. Frank knew she was talking about more than custodial work. In his retirement speech, Frank Morrison said simply, I've had the honor of serving alongside the finest people in the world, working on projects that will inspire humanity for generations to come. If I helped keep this place safe and clean so that brilliant minds could reach for the stars, then I've done my job. The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, but it couldn't convey the full truth, that Frank Morrison had literally saved the moon landing from those who would have destroyed it. That truth would remain hidden for another 30 years. In 2019, 50 years after Apollo 11, the CIA declassified documents related to security threats against the American space program. Buried in thousands of pages of redacted reports was a brief reference to domestic terrorism prevention during Apollo operations and the involvement of civilian security assets with military backgrounds. A retired NASA historian named Dr. James Mitchell was researching the declassified documents when he discovered Frank Morrison's name in a heavily redacted intelligence summary. Cross-referencing personnel records, Dr. Mitchell realized that a custodian had been involved in preventing attacks on the moon landing. Dr. Mitchell tracked down Frank Morrison, now 92 years old and living quietly in a retirement community near Cape Canaveral. When he asked about the events of July 15, 1969, Frank smiled and said simply, I did my job. It took Dr. Mitchell 6 months to piece together the full story from declassified intelligence reports, NASA security logs, and Frank's carefully measured recollections. When he published his findings in the Journal of Space History, the revelation made international headlines. Forgotten hero saved Apollo 11, custodian prevented terrorist attack on moon landing. Frank Morrison, now one of the last surviving witnesses to humanity's first steps on the moon, found himself the subject of interviews, documentaries, and tributes from around the world. He accepted the attention with the same quiet dignity he'd brought to every challenge in his life. I was just doing what needed to be done, Frank told reporters. When you love something, whether it's your country, your family, or humanity's dream of exploring the stars, you protect it. That's not heroism, that's just responsibility. Frank Morrison died peacefully in 2021, at the age of 94. His funeral was attended by NASA administrators, retired astronauts, and dozens of custodial workers who understood that the greatest service often goes unrecognized. Neil Armstrong had died 9 years earlier, but Buzz Aldrin, now in his 90s, spoke at Frank's memorial service. "We stood on the moon because of people like Frank Morrison," Aldrin said. "Not just the engineers and the rocket scientists, but the guardians who kept our dreams safe from those who would destroy them." Frank didn't ask for recognition. He didn't want his name in the history books, he just wanted humanity to reach for the stars. And because of him, we did. Today, a small plaque near the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex reads, "In memory of Frank Morrison, 1927 to 2021. Custodian, guardian, American hero. He kept the dream alive." Below the inscription is a simple image, a mop and bucket beside a rocket ship, with the inscription, "Service comes in many forms." Frank Morrison never walked on the moon, never rode a rocket into space, never had his footprints preserved in lunar dust for eternity. But on July 16, 1969, he made sure that others could. And sometimes, that's the most heroic thing of all. So now I ask you, especially those who remember that remarkable summer of 1969, do you recall where you were when Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon? Did you ever wonder about the countless unsung heroes who made that moment possible? Share your memories of the moon landing in the comments. Tell us about the everyday heroes in your own life, the people who protected your dreams while asking for nothing in return. Because here at Hidden Valor Stories, we believe the greatest achievements are built on the shoulders of forgotten guardians. Thank you for watching this tribute to Frank Morrison and all the invisible protectors who kept humanity's greatest dreams alive. If this story honored someone you know who served quietly and faithfully, subscribe and help us celebrate the hidden valor that makes miracles possible. And remember, sometimes the most important heroes are the ones pushing mop buckets, standing guard while others reach for the stars.